online and on smartphones. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to News Hour from the BBC World Service. I'm Audrey Brown. The authorities in the besieged Ukrainian port of Mariupol say Russia has bombed a theater and attacked a civilian convoy. We've been hearing from the Slovenian Prime Minister, who met the Ukrainian president in the flesh yesterday.
He is really tired, but at the same time, his energy is enormous, and this is why over 90% of the Ukrainians are supporting him.
Meanwhile, President Zelensky has again pleaded with U.S. lawmakers to institute a no-fly zone. As Russia steps up attacks on Kyiv, we hear from civilians.
Of course I'm afraid. I'm really scared. It is frightening for children who have to experience all this. They will have such memories. It will scar their entire life.
All that and more directly after the news.
Hello, I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. The Ukrainian authorities say Russian forces have bombed a theatre in the besieged city of Mariupol that was being used by large numbers of civilians as a shelter. The city is surrounded by Russian forces and has been under constant bombardment for weeks. Hugo Bachega reports from Lviv.
Mariupol officials say a Russian plane dropped a bomb on the city's theatre, where up to 1,200 civilians were sheltering. They say Russia deliberately and cynically hit the site, a huge Soviet-era building in the city center. Ukraine's foreign minister called it another horrendous war crime, saying it was impossible that Russia didn't know the place was a civilian shelter. The attack is one of a number of civilian buildings that were said to have been targeted by Russia in cities across Ukraine during the day. The Russian Defense Ministry has denied attacking the theater.
President Biden says the U.S. will give a further $800 million in military aid to Ukraine, warning the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, that he will be made to pay for his atrocities there. He said the U.S. would provide anti-tank weapons, air defense systems and drones to Kyiv. Mr. Biden praised what he called the remarkable courage of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who earlier made an impassioned plea to the U.S. Congress for more help. More details from Nomia Iqbal.
What really stuck out about President Zelensky's speech is that he talked about fighting for freedom, fighting for our values, standing up to dictators. You know, this is the sort of language that the West uses about its own mission in the world. It's the language that the West recognises and is always celebrating, certainly politicians here. And it really did resonate with them. You know, he's essentially saying to leaders in the US, putting them on the spot, saying, look, put your money where your mouth is, help me.
In his speech to Congress by video link, President Zelensky implored America to impose a no-fly zone over his country to stop Russia's deadly offensive. The U.S. has repeatedly ruled out a no-fly zone. Mr. Zelensky told President Biden that being a world leader meant being the leader of world peace. The U.S. Federal Reserve has raised interest rates for the first time since 2018 to help tackle the highest inflation in 4 decades. The Fed said the war in Ukraine was expected to cut growth and increase prices. Here's Michelle Fleury.
According to the Federal Reserve, most signs point to a strengthening U.S. economy. Jobs are being created at a rapid pace, and the unemployment rate has fallen to near record lows. Nonetheless, inflation has become a pressing concern. Prices in the U.S. are rising at a higher rate than for 40 years. Now, a war in Europe has added a huge new cause for concern for policymakers. In his press conference following the Fed's monetary policy meeting, Chairman Jerome Powell said the invasion of Ukraine had highly uncertain implications for the U.S. economy.
World News from the BBC. The British-Iranian woman Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, detained for nearly 6 years in Iran, is due to arrive in the UK within hours. Freed along with a fellow dual national, Anusha Ashari, she'll be reunited with her husband Richard and 7-year-old daughter. The child, Gabriella, was less than 2 years old when her mother was arrested in 2016. Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe was convicted of plotting to overthrow the Iranian government, a charge she's always denied. Prosecutors in New York have accused an alleged Chinese intelligence agent of harassing a former Chinese dissident who's now running for the U.S. Congress. Chi Ming-lin has been charged with trying to intimidate the candidate and sabotage his chances of winning a seat in the House of Representatives. The candidate hasn't been officially identified, but is thought to be Yan Xiong. Over 1,000 anti-slavery campaigners from across West Africa are meeting in Mauritania as efforts are renewed to eradicate the practice. Will Ross has this report.
The subject's rarely discussed publicly in Mauritania, so for an anti-slavery conference to be hosted in the capital Nouakchott is a breakthrough. It was the last country in the world to abolish the practice in 1981, but it's remained rooted in Mauritanian society, with thousands of women and children from the Haratin ethnic group still living in slave-like conditions as bonded labourers for Arab Berber families. Under successive governments, more anti-slavery campaigners were being locked up than slave owners. Now, the Human Rights Commissioner, Sheikh Amadou Ould Sidi, has said very publicly that the government's determined to eliminate slavery and end discrimination.
One person has died in Japan and dozens were injured when a powerful earthquake struck off the country's northeastern coast. 2 million homes were left without power and a bullet train was derailed. None of its passengers were hurt. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service, coming to you live from London. I'm Audrey Brown. Now, the war in Ukraine is in its third week, and the attacks on civilians continue. The Ukrainian authorities have again accused the Russian forces of attacking a humanitarian convoy out of Mariupol, which is the southern port city that has been under siege for days now. We'll be hearing from someone who was in that convoy as it tried to leave shortly. But first to Kiev and our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet. Lise, what's the latest in Kiev?
The latest in Kiev is that this is a capital city under a 35-hour curfew. It won't lift till tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock local time, 5G. And we've been hearing, we think, the reasons why the city is under curfew ever since it came into force yesterday. There has been more sustained artillery fire on the edges of the city than at any other time in the invasion. It is getting louder, more sustained, and also seems to be getting closer. There were huge plumes of black smoke on the northwestern approach to the city during the day, also seeming to confirm reports that the Ukrainians have called a ceasefire, or rather a curfew here, then because they launched a counterattack against the Russian forces, which are trying to advance on the city from the northwest.
And we've been hearing about attacks on civilians around the country. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, in many places around the country, major cities, Melitopol, this continues in the south, Chernihiv in the north, and of course the besieged southern city of Mariupol, which has been described as a grave humanitarian catastrophe by the United Nations Secretary General. It's been besieged for many weeks, and then tonight we heard terrifying reports that a theater, which has been sheltering more than 1,000 people, came under attack. The Ukrainians are calling it a horrendous war crime, but the Russian Defense Ministry says it did not attack the theater.
And we've also been hearing, Lise, about people waiting in line for bread, or a bread factory being hit as well.
Yes, that is in the north. Initially, that report was denied, but then more reports that we received show that people who were simply trying to queue up to get some bread came under attack there and sadly lost their lives.
And Lisa, is there any sense that people are, getting? I mean, I imagine they're getting really tired of this. But what is the mood like in Kiev?
Well, Kiev is a city which has been emptied of many of its people. It's hard to say with any statistical certainty how many have fled. We heard from the mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, last week, who said under 2 million, just under 2 million, had already fled the city, mainly women taking their children. Men who are between the ages of 18 to 60 cannot leave, but they are be conscripted into the army. But everyone I meet, young, old, male, female, they all say, this is a war we're going to win.
Thank you very much. That's our chief international correspondent, Lisa Set. Now, after several unsuccessful attempts to get trapped civilians out of the city, Russia stopped the bombing long enough to allow thousands of people to leave Mariupol. It didn't last, and there was another attack on a convoy just yesterday. A short while ago, I spoke to a woman who was in that convoy.
There was, on the 14th, the planes were bombing us constantly without any gaps in between the bombings. It was just constant. Every attack was clearly aimed at the different sections of the city, and they were clearly aiming on civilian housing. So the convoy of cars trying to leave the city was fired at as they were leaving the city before they got to the checkpoints. So that as they're in Zaporozhye, and they were coming into what they call a grey zone, which is less dangerous, I suppose. There was a field that was on fire, and 2 cars also came under fire, and there were people in the cars who were seriously injured, and some Ukrainian soldiers came to try and help them. They were driving across the fields, and when they came off the fields onto the roads, the shooting started at the convoy. They tried not to go across the bridge. They went across the fields instead, and it was when they came on the fields, there was firing as they came back onto the main road.
Who was she traveling with? Members of her family?
So we were taken by some people who we know, but we were with my mum and my niece, who's 10 years old.
And there was a young woman who had managed to get out of Mariupol. Now, President Volodymyr Zelensky has been addressing lawmakers in the U.S., and he made use of the opportunity to make an emotional appeal to Americans to impose a no-fly zone. Speaking via video link from Kiev and greeted with a standing ovation, he gave a moving speech.
The American people are helping not just Ukraine, but Europe and the world to keep the planet alive, to keep justice in history. Now I'm almost 45 years old. Today my age stopped when the hearts of more than 100 children stopped beating. I see no sense in life if it cannot stop the death. And this is my main mission as the leader of my people, great Ukrainians.
That's President Zelensky addressing the U.S. House of Congress earlier today via video link. The Prime Minister of Slovenia saw Mr. Zelensky in the flesh yesterday. Prime Minister Janez Janša, along with the Prime Ministers from Poland and the Czech Republic, took a train to Kiev to meet the Ukrainian leader. He told me about the journey.
We have traveled through the western part of the country where there is no war on the ground. There were some attacks by missiles and planes. But even from the train, you clearly see that this part of the country is preparing for the war. So there are blockades, checking points, military vehicles, people in uniform. So you see that also this part of the country, which is quite far from the actual fighting, is prepared for a war.
What can you tell us about what you discussed with Mr. Zelensky?
We discussed the real issues, so no theoretical debates. This means sanctions, all kind of help for Ukraine, humanitarian help, technical help, how to help the refugees, and also military help. We also discussed the future, the possible framework for a lasting peace agreement.
And were you able to offer Mr. Zelensky and Ukraine solid military help, more help than what is being offered now?
Actually, a lot of help has been offered so far. The problem is that all offers haven't been fulfilled yet, but the time is of essence. Every day is counted in Ukraine during the war, during the aggression, in hundreds of lives. So we discussed very concretely how to increase the speed of the delivery.
How was Mr. Zelensky? Because we see him on television, on social media platforms, being very encouraging. He's also impassioned because he's defending his country. But he is under serious pressure and in agony as his country is being destroyed around him. How did he appear to you?
I know from our own experiences how you feel after you're not sleeping 2 or 3 weeks. He is really tired, but at the same time, his energy is enormous. He is radiating determination of whole nation, and this is why over 90% of the Ukrainians are supporting him. We had also spoken during last week with all opposition leaders. They are all behind him. They are supportive. Ukrainian political landscape is, before the war, was quite turbulent, but now all the opposition leaders are behind him. I have never seen in my life such a level of unity, not only unity of the nation, but unity of the political class. So Russians miscalculated heavily also the political landscape of the Ukraine. I think they counted on some parties to support them and they will fight among themselves. This is not happening. I think we can all see this energy which is making Ukraine nation being reborn in this difficult situation.
So Mr. Zelensky has said that Ukraine cannot now join NATO. But do you think that Ukraine should still join the EU? Because you have been critical of the EU in the past, but you've also called for Ukraine to be fast-tracked to admission. How do you feel about it now?
Neither NATO, neither European Union, they're not something which is without any mistakes. But if people were not aware so far, especially young generations, that both European Union and NATO were created not first because of the economy and because of the welfare and so on, but mostly to preserve peace, to bring peace to this continent after 2 devastating wars. And yes, if Ukraine is prepared to change its constitution, to put NATO membership aside, and this is something which Russia is putting as a main reason for invading Ukraine, then hot potato is on the table of the European Union, of course, and this is why I think we have to accept this challenge. We have to stop to pretend that this is the situation and it's normal, that we need 15 years of negotiations and bickering about the small issues. This is a strategic decision, and for Ukraine, EU membership is some kind of security, part of the security guarantees framework. They need some institutional guarantees, and if the European Union is something like that for them, we have to respect this.
Do you think that other countries will now, and other leaders now, be going to Ukraine to go and show their support in the way that you have?
Yes, they will. This is very important. When we entered the Ukrainian train, we saw in the eyes of those people working on plane traffic issues and so on, how happy they are that somebody is coming, because frankly speaking, during last 3 weeks, they were able to follow just opposite route. Some ambassadors left Kiev even before the Russian aggression. So now we have to somehow to turn the trend, and our first proposal together with Polish and Czech Prime Minister when we returned from Kiev this morning was that the European Union has to send its representative back to Kiev to have there somebody who is possible to represent us physically.
What do you think now should happen with Mr. Putin?
If he's prepared to negotiate, then he will have, I think, influence over what will happen with him in the future. If not, and if he is militarily defeated in Ukraine, which is possible now, with the withdrawal with the Russian military units, we will withdraw the sanctions. Faster the withdrawal of the Russian military, faster the lifting of the sanctions.
Slovenian Prime Minister Janez Janša there. Still to come this hour, we have a special report from Afghanistan, where international aid has been largely suspended since the takeover by the Taliban.
The moment here in Afghanistan is critical for children. There are 1 million children under 5 who are at risk of dying, and every decision the world makes, politicians make, will impact these children.
Other stories, the authorities in the besieged Ukrainian port of Mariupol say Russia has bombed a theater where more than 1,000 civilians were sheltering. President Biden has promised a further $800 million in military aid to Ukraine, including air defense systems. The U.S. Central Bank has raised interest rates for the first time since 2018 as the war in Ukraine pushes prices upwards. And the British-Iranian woman Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is due back in the UK soon after nearly 6 years in detention in Iran. You're listening to NewsHour here on the BBC World Service, coming to you live from London. I'm Audrey Brown. Ukraine has continued to endure heavy bombardment from Russian forces, even while peace talks are continuing. In the capital, Kiev, the mayor has warned that the city is facing a difficult and dangerous moment after at least 4 people were killed in Russian airstrikes overnight. Residential buildings were hit, along with a metro station. A 35-hour curfew has been imposed, with residents of the city asked to stay at home for the next 2 days and only leave if air raid sirens sound and they need to reach bomb shelters. Our international correspondent Ola Guerin has this report.
I'm standing in front of an apartment building, a block of flats. There are about 16 stories and the building is completely destroyed. There's dense black smoke still billowing out. Some of the flats are still on fire. The fire brigade is here trying to put out the blaze. This is a residential building, and looking around, there's nothing else here except blocks of flats. This is the second day running that Kyiv has woken up to scenes like this. The emergency services say the building was hit by a Russian shell. There is a real sense here now that the danger, the conflict, is coming closer to the capital, and a feeling that nowhere is safe. We're with a lady who lives in one of the neighbouring apartment blocks now.
It was horror, fear. I live in the house about 300 feet away from the place of this catastrophe. I was woken from a powerful blast in the night. Saw from my window that the building was on fire. A friend of mine lives on the 14th floor of the building. I think she must have died because she's bedridden.
Could I ask you, are you afraid now of what's happening here in Kyiv?
Of course I'm afraid. I'm really scared. It is frightening for children who have to experience all this. They will have such memories. It will scar their entire life.
How do you feel about what Russia is doing here?
I'm originally Russian. This is horror. It's barbarism. Those are actions of a psychologically unstable person.
I'm in Borisville, on the outskirts of Kyiv, in a garden beside a church, and a funeral is underway here for a colonel who was killed in the fighting. There are full military honours here. Many troops present, a lot of them with flowers in their hands, and friends and neighbours have come to pay their last respects, standing in a semicircle around the coffin. I'm with Valentine, who was a friend of Colonel Valery Guts for 40 years. Valentine, can you tell me about him?
Valery was a patriot. The last time I saw him was February 23rd. I asked, Valery, will there be war? He didn't believe it would start. He would say, it can't happen, it's impossible. Nobody needs a war. And look at what happened. There are so many people saying goodbye to him. Just look. There are shells and air raids, but still people come. We're not afraid of the Russian armed forces. We're not afraid of anybody.
Ukraine's losses are growing as the days pass. At the weekend, President Zelensky said 1,300 troops had been killed. But you don't get the feeling here that resistance is weakening. Quite the opposite. It seems like after all the death and destruction since Russia invaded, people have become more determined to resist, both civilians and Ukrainian forces. And there's also no sign that the Russians are preparing to change course. Talks are continuing, and on the ground, the fighting grinds on.
That's our international correspondent, Ola Guerin. Now, as Russia continues its onslaught on major cities, the military has started to deploy siege tactics using cluster munitions and bombing civilian infrastructure previously used in conflicts in Syria and Chechnya. Dr. Margarita Konaev is an expert in Russian military artificial intelligence and urban warfare. She's at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology in the U.S. I asked her about the range of tactics being used across Ukrainian cities.
We're definitely seeing a variation in tactics across the Ukrainian cities. A lot of it has to do with Russian capabilities. We see that Russian supply issues and logistical problems are less severe in the south, and that's in part why their siege on the city of Mariupol has already been so intensive and has caused the type of, robust, catastrophic humanitarian emergencies that you've been discussing today on your program, and we've been watching over the several weeks. Meanwhile, in the north, in Kiev, resistance there has been stronger, while Russian supply and logistical problems have been more severe. So progress has really not been significant towards taking the capital. And that big, protracted Russian major armored column has really not been able to reach the capital.
What informs the tactics?
The political motivations, the political goals of the campaign, which is in many ways to bring Ukraine to a point of surrender. Another is the fact that Russia has seen those tactics work previously in keeping Assad in power in Syria and in keeping Chechnya part of Russia.
And are they working here? Because all indications are that the Ukrainians are fighting back really hard.
Absolutely. Ukrainian resistance has truly been inspiring and heroic, and it's also been very successful, partially because when it comes to urban warfare, the defender actually has the advantage. It's difficult to judge where they're working because it's still quite early in the campaign, and I think we're only going to be able to see how this situation progresses in the next couple of weeks, if not months. And unfortunately, there's going to be severe humanitarian consequences coming out of these siege and urban warfare tactics.
So is Russia throwing everything it can at this war?
No. I would have to say that looking at the level of the troops deployed there, Russia still has a lot more that they can do and many more troops and capabilities that it can deploy. It has also, to some extent, has not employed the type of extensive, relentless aerial and artillery bombardments that we have seen it used in Syria, as well as Chechnya before. So Russia still has other capabilities.
And that was Dr. Margarita Konaev, who is an expert in Russian military artificial intelligence and urban warfare. Now, just a reminder that you can listen to NewsHour whenever you like. We've got 2 editions a day, and you can find the latest online at bbcworldservice.com. Better still, sign up for our free download. Just search for BBC NewsHour podcast. This is NewsHour from the BBC World Service. I'm Audrey Brown.